Welcome to my channel. One of my interests is Jan Smuts and South African history. And I've come across this book recently in an old bookstore. It's called South African Personality and Places, and it's by Bernard Sachs. People might know someone called L.B. Sachs, who was a struggle hero for the ANC. And Bernard Sachs is actually the uncle of L.B. Sachs. And L.B. Sachs's father is a chap called Solly Sachs, who was quite a well-known unionist in South Africa, and he organized poor white Afrikaners into the South African Garment Workers Union. He tried to turn them into socialists, and in that perhaps he failed. I'm going to read this piece and break off into commentary as I go. It's titled General Jan Christian Smuts, a Proconsul in Africa. And I think the Proconsul is to suggest that Smuts is in some ways an extension of the British Empire in South Africa. Sachs writes, there were two assaults on the citadel of Afrikaner nationalism during the last 50 years, both of which were beaten back. The major one came from General Smuts, the minor one from his brother, Solly Sachs. At different levels, both aspired to draw South Africa away from the influence of little Afrikanerdom into the world orbit. Smuts tried it through the British liberal tradition, and Solly through the labour movement. The salient facts of South African history will help to explain why they were both defeated. Sociologists are now generally agreed that economics play a major part in social evolution. But this does not appear to apply in South Africa, where racial conflict and passion are paramount. Well, that remains the truth to this day. So much so that the present and enduring interests of the nation are being sacrificed to these racial hates rooted in a tragic past. The Afrikaner as an individual possesses all the good qualities of the peasant, such as kindliness and hospitality. But a history replete with many bitter moments has tended to make him hard and incorrigible. The Afrikaners fought a difficult battle for survival in a land far removed from the center of civilization. The civilization they themselves built was not a natural extension from its base in the Cape, but an unnatural tearaway in the form of the Great Trek. For many years, the British were little concerned with the Afrikaners who had moved away into the interior with the Great Trek. The Cape was important to the British as a strategic point on the route from India. The discovery of gold and diamonds transformed the situation completely, however. England coveted Naboth's gold mines, and there followed the dramatic struggle between Rhodes and Kruger for possession. The Afrikaners had obtained sanction for the subjection of the African tribes by reference to the lot of Ham, son of Noah. The British statesman Lord Milner sought sanction for the conquest of the Boers with the declaration that a medieval race oligarchy could no longer have the fate of a great modern industry in its hands. 3 years of hard fighting in the Boer War wrested this great modern industry from the Afrikaners. However, there was a lot of sympathy for the Boers in their heroic struggle with a mighty imperial nation. But it cannot be denied that from the purely economic aspect, Lord Milner was right. It was good for South Africa's economy that there was a British Empire. And this is of significance today as the contours of South Africa's economy are being shaped. Now, Sachs writes, this cannot be openly said in a country where 2/3 of the white population are Afrikaners. Well, it couldn't be said back then, but it can be said now. And diplomacy has to be resorted to. Lord Milner said it in the buccaneering days of Joseph Chamberlain. So when he was writing in 1959, it was the height of the Afrikaner nationalism. The apartheid government had come to power in 1948. So one had to perhaps choose one's words carefully when saying that a British war on the Afrikaners may have been justified. Now, he writes, around about 1905, when time was beginning to wash away the hates engendered by the Boer War, well, that's a bit premature, it would take a lot longer than that, the British Premier Campbell Bannerman decided that Lord Milner's policy of the need for breaking the neck of Afrikanerdom, as Milner put it, was not likely to make a peaceful possession of South Africa. Bannerman's was the modern approach to politics. He acted on the principle that if you spear an opponent, he can become furious as a whale and overturn the boat, but if you tickle him, he falls gently into your hands like a trout. The period of appeasement of the Boers saw the rise of General Smuts. General Smuts was the only South African figure of world stature. His life reveals much that is salient in South Africa itself, as well as the links that bind it to the world. The Cape, where Smuts was born, was too placid for this youth who, as a student at Stellenbosch, had been carried away by Cecil Rhodes's dream of a greater South Africa. So before the Boer War, Smuts had actually worked for the great imperialist Cecil John Rhodes. But after the Jameson raids, an attempted coup against the Kruger government in the Transvaal, backed by Rhodes, Smuts became very disillusioned with Rhodes and with the British in general. And Sachs writes, the feverish tempo of the Transvaal towards the end of the century, where a climax was approaching in the struggle between Boer and Britain for hegemony, drew Smuts in 1896. He threw himself. Now by 1896, he had left Rhodes and he was actually working under Paul Kruger, the leader of the Transvaal Boer Republic. And Smuts threw himself with all his intellect and passion into the conflict. And in a book he wrote just before the outbreak of the Boer War, entitled A Century of Wrong, he gave expression to sentiments that, for their intensity, recall the heroic stand of Holland against Spain and the dramas of Schiller. And here is a passage that conveys the bitterness the Boers felt towards Britain and which carried over into the years long after the Boer War had ended. So Smuts wrote in that book, A Century of Wrong, up to the present, our people have remained silent. We have been spat upon by the enemy, slandered, harried, and treated with every possible mark of disdain and contempt. But our people, with a dignity which reminds the world of a greater and more painful example of suffering, have borne in silence the taunts and derision of their opponents. And as the wounded antelope awaits the coming of the lion, the jackal, and the vulture, so do our people all over South Africa contemplate the approach of the foe. So Smuts is writing in 1896 and he's anticipating exactly what would happen. Britain would come for the Boer republics, and particularly the Transvaal, where gold had been discovered in great quantity. Smuts, Sachs writes, was not only a scholar, he was a man of action. In the Boer War, at the head of a commando, he overcame every difficulty he encountered. The English soldiery continually in pursuit, the mountain passes, flooded rivers, with the ease that he moved through the intricacies of Immanuel Kant's critique of pure reason, which he carried in his saddlebag right through the war. Smuts was a brilliant guerrilla tactical commander. He only had 400 men, and he literally tied up 10,000, 20,000 British troops in trying to chase him down. So he was hugely successful. Sachs writes, defeat in the Boer War found Smuts in the abyss of despair. 1902, Treaty of Vereeniging, the Boers surrender to the British. And in a letter to Emily Hobhouse, that's the English nurse who had tended the sick Boer women in Kitchener's concentration camps, Smuts conveys to us in somber cadences the bleakness of his mood as his country lay under the foot of the conqueror. So after this defeat, he writes to Emily Hobhouse, who's very much pro-Boer, and she had really helped them during those terrible concentration camps that had led to the death of 29,000 Boer women and children, and about 12,000 African servants as well. He writes to Hobhouse and he says, you twit me, you joke with me about watering my orange trees when I ought to be up and doing. Smuts was in retirement around 1903, 1904. He was out of politics, the war was over, and he was at his home in Irene on his farm, literally watering his orange trees. He didn't know what to do with himself. And he says to Hobhouse, what is there for me to do? I and mine belong to the vanquished, and over our country is now being written, with ink which no time will ever fade, the brutal via victis policy of the conqueror. To scream, to make a noise, even resolutely to agitate is not my line. South Africa is on the downgrade. One's only consolation is such a scene is to watch the trees grow, to see how nature teems with every new and fresh life, and absorbs the evil and dreary waste of yesterday into the beauty of tomorrow. Sometimes, when I think over the past, I wonder whether, after all, it would not be best for the Afrikaner people to quit the tests, resign to their British opponents, and in peacefulness find that consolation to which they are now justly entitled after a century of fruitless strife. One becomes sick and tired of life's toil and endless endeavors and begins to long for rest. Place me in my old age among the hills and the koppies, where as a little child I looked after the sheep and cattle, and let me lie where I was raised from Mother Nature. But Smuts was not the man to retire to the gentle folds of nature. As a realist, he accepted the facts of the situation and steered his course accordingly. What were the factors that reconciled him to Britain? There was the Bannerman liberal policy, which made a reconciliation possible. But this alone does not explain why a section of the Afrikaners remained intractable, while Smuts orientated himself afresh in a manner that is one of the miracles of the modern political age. Sachs writes, Smuts was born in the civilized sedateness of the Cape, and he acquired his education at Cambridge, where he had a most distinguished scholastic career, and he developed a European outlook. He studied law there, and he was an outstanding student. During his years as a student, he wrote a book on Walt Whitman, waxing rhapsodical about the spirit of democracy which Whitman celebrates and which, to the Smuts of later years, was realized in the British Commonwealth. Smuts believed that the kingdom of God on earth would be established on the model of the British Empire, writes Sachs, somewhat facetiously. Paul Kruger's Transvaal was, with all its virtues, backward and agrarian, whose isolation had left it encased in the crust of medievalism. It was good enough for the farmer General de Wet and for the Calvinist Dr. Milan, this medieval approach. But Smuts was more of a botanist than a farmer, more of a pantheist than a theologian. Smuts was very much a modern man. A blade of grass is for the average Boer farmer just fodder for cattle, but for Smuts it was an etude in the metamorphosis of species, which so fascinated Goethe. Another outstanding characteristic of Smuts was his emphasis on order, the spirit of which the Dutch painters of the 17th century immortalized with their stately interiors, and which emerges from the prose of such as Spinoza and Grotius. Here is the solidity of a symmetrical stone edifice, for it embodies the hope and aspirations of the rising middle classes about to place their stamp on civilization moving into the age of reason. Well, here's a very, very important point. The Afrikaners, when Sachs is writing this, are really the last of the Protestant white European communities to move up the scale into bourgeois living. Okay, so they do come to it eventually, but they come to it lately, and they are the world's last white Protestants to move to become bourgeoisified. He writes, Smuts made it his life's mission to impose order on South Africa, a raw young country. And he borrowed much from the Roman Empire and from Mussolini's fascist Italy. That's somewhat controversial, but anyway. But it did not prove simple. There were the clashes with the workers on the Rand. On top of this, the majority of the Afrikaners were intensely anti-imperialist. Clausewitz had it that war was politics conducted by other means. The Afrikaners reversed the dictum regarding politics as a continuation of war by other means. Their strategy after 1902 was to wipe out their defeat in the Boer War by political process. Here it is possible to say that Smuts, in embracing British ideals, displayed the excessive zeal of the convert, which, allied to a dictatorial temper, tended all too often to aggravate animosities, more particularly in the early part of his career. From the despondency that overcame him after the defeat of the Boer War, when he thought of retiring to the mountains, he had moved back into society with a rebound that made him the terror of South Africa. Symphonically, the solemnity of the second movement was followed by a furious third. General Smuts' struggles with the white labour movement, which lasted for close on 20 years, furnished some of the most dramatic episodes in the history of South Africa. The discovery of diamonds and gold suddenly thrust the country forward into the industrial 20th century. Not only was capital coming in by the millions from abroad, but Cornish miners were arriving from the tin mines of Cornwall to help the gigantic gold mining industry to get started. And they brought with them the militant trade union tradition from Britain. Smuts, who had set himself the task of imposing order on the South African scene, treated these refractory workers with the disdain of a native tribe that would not submit to his authority. Where the Africans were dubbed savages, a classification which placed them outside the pale, Smuts called the militant workers by the sinister name of syndicalists, against whom the state was entitled to use every draconian measure. It forms the least worthy phase of his whole political career. The mob fought back, as only a Johannesburg mob can, and soon Smuts gathered about his name more hates than any person in the history of South Africa. So Smuts does know how to make enemies as well. He's very decisive. What he does, he goes in hard. So he makes enemies of Afrikaner nationalists by being too close to the British, and he makes enemies of these radical white workers as well by using violence to suppress their strikes. Smuts himself, though, he couldn't understand it. At one political meeting, he exclaimed, just before he was shouted down, "What can you do with our South Africans? It is our history to hate. We want trouble. The people want to misunderstand me." The 1922 revolt started with the miners going on strike, but in his efforts to subdue them, Smuts acted so lustily that before long it was transformed into an upheaval which shook the country from end to end. However, it must be conceded that Smuts was not alone responsible for the sharpness that these struggles always tended to assume. The mining camp character of the interior of South Africa contributed a great deal. The fortuitous circumstances of the discovery of diamonds and gold brought to the country a feverish flow of fortune seekers who were ready to leave the crowded cities of Europe and their amenities for what distant Africa could offer. On the austere plain that forms the interior of South Africa, the adventurers who had failed to find life congenial in Vilna, Budapest and Berlin met the Boers who had rebelled against the ordered life of the Cape under English rule. From then on, the history of South Africa is seething and formless. Many things are happening, but there is little stability, permanence, or theme. There's clusters of people from every part of the world settled around these gold and diamond mines. But these did not constitute towns or cities, and altogether lacked the cultural attributes of the city. There was a spirit of impermanence animating this cosmopolitan stream, which came to fill their pockets and then to return to their homes overseas. The turbulence of mood was swelled by the poor whites who flocked in large numbers to the towns with the rise of the gold industry, where little skill was required to direct black miners to drill their jackhammers into the gold ore. Afrikaners all, they were violently anti-English. No wonder Smuts had to discard his philosophy of holism in order to assert himself against the surge of raw life. It was very unfortunate all round that he replaced the velvet beguilements of philosophy with the mailed fist, which he was all too ready to send into the face of any opposition that stood in his way. But Smuts mellowed in his later years. Nowhere is this more evident than in the remarkable letters that passed between him and the communist Bill Andrews, when the latter, Andrews, was celebrating his 80th birthday. Smuts was very anti-communist, so even for him to be writing to Andrews says something. No biographer of Smuts can ignore them, for they furnish new insights into this man, whose spirit harbored so many conflicting drives. The circumstances surrounding the correspondence are worth noting. Smuts and Andrews had been lifelong opponents, first in Parliament, of which Andrews was a member before the First World War, and then during the numerous industrial disputes. Andrews was in fact imprisoned by Smuts after the 22 revolt. In his later years, Andrews, though still nominally a member of the Communist Party, had long since retired from active politics and was living in a remote suburb of Cape Town. Smuts must have spent some time locating his address, where he has sent him a letter of facilitation which read, "My dear Andrews, though belated by a few days, I wish to send you my warm congratulations on your 80th anniversary and wish you health and strength for the years that still lie ahead. We too, almost the same age, have passed through an era of great events and have much to look back upon and to ruminate over. Often our courses have clashed, but always too, I hope, there has been respect for each other in spite of the differences. And now, as we near the end, we can salute each other and wish each other well for what may lie ahead." Now Andrews replied, "My dear General, thank you very much for your kind message of congratulation and good wishes. Yes, in spite of our differences, which I suppose arise from the observation of social phenomena from different angles, we have at least one thing in common, our age. Those who remember and took some part in affairs from the early days of the Witwatersrand goldfields are becoming few in number. Their work, whatever it may have been, is drawing to a close. It should therefore be possible, as you suggest, for mutual respect between old warriors who have fought well and honourably, although generally on the opposite sides of the barricades. I hope to congratulate you in a few days on completing your 80th year. Your life has been crowded with stirring scenes and dramatic happenings, with great responsibilities shouldered and with international and national honours conferred, such as fall to the lot of only few men. I agree. We can salute and pass with calmness and dignity to meet whatever the fates have prepared. Good wishes, sincerely, W.H. Andrews. What this letter meant to Smuts is evident from his acknowledgement. My dear Andrews, what a very nice and welcome letter you've written me. I do want to say to you in all sincerity that I appreciate it very much. So old comrades of the wars salute each other as they pass from the stage. Sincerely, Smuts. Smuts died within a month of writing this letter. He must have had a death premonition. Many of his actions during his lifetime justifiably gained him the reputation of being a hard and ruthless man. The correspondence with Andrews establishes his deep and essential humanity. Andrews died 6 months later. In some ways, Smuts's position resembled that of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, when the struggle between the liberal industrialists of America and the feudal planters had reached a critical point. Agriculture lies mostly in the hands of the Afrikaners, and it is on the socio-economic level of the feudal southern states before the Civil War. But there are important differences that helped to defeat Smuts where Lincoln was victorious. In America, the slaves were a negligible force in relation to the whites. In South Africa, the blacks outnumbered the whites by 4-1. They are growing in strength and are beginning to constitute a threat to the white man's hegemony, where until recently they were politically inarticulate. So that's important. He's writing in 59, and from then on we really are seeing black resistance starting to find its voice against the white supremacist regime. In America also, the industrialists were Lincoln's main support, but the economy of South Africa has tended to strengthen the feudal elements. The Master and Servants Act is the basis of agriculture. The gold mining industry, politically an important pillar for the Smuts policy, linked as it is to Britain, is itself based on indentured labour. In secondary industry, the colour bar is a decisive factor, with the white worker determined to keep the African from encroaching on his skilled preserves. And this applies both to the English and Afrikaner worker. With the expansion of South Africa's economy, skilled labour will have to be drawn from the coloured and black sections, and this will further furnish the basis for a liberal policy. Well, he's prophetic around that. That's exactly what happened. The mining interests who are beginning to invest in secondary industry are ready to face the economic and political facts of life and are adopting a more progressive policy towards black labour, even in the face of government opposition. And that's exactly how apartheid was wound down, by the way. But this factor did not operate during the Smuts regime, when the spirit of liberalism which began to manifest itself was largely sentimental. Another factor which contributed to Smuts' defeat, as important as any perhaps, is the weakening of the British Empire, from which he drew all his elan in his struggle with Afrikaner nationalism. Smuts was a disappointed man at the end of his life. It was very moving to see this man of real stature pitting himself in Parliament against an opposition mainly representative of the farming community, whose political philosophy is constituted of two components: black labour at the cheapest price, this is the economic reality behind the racial myth, and the marketing of produce at the dearest. Smuts was defeated by the black peril agitation they let loose. There is much that is tragic in Smuts' life. Such was his fervent belief in the capacity of the British Empire to guide civilization, that he was prepared to break with his whole past when he chose the new road. It more than once brought him into conflict with his erstwhile comrades who had fought by his side in the Boer War and left behind searing memories. In 1914, when war broke out, many of the Boers went into rebellion and joined the Germans, and it was Smuts' task to subdue them. Like the liberals everywhere, Smuts was confounded by the turbulence of this chaotic age and the specific problems inherent in the South African scene. He failed to remove many obstacles that blocked the forward advance of his country because he could not muster the necessary social energy from the nation to remove the very heavy hand of the past. Such was the balance of social tensions within South Africa that without the impact of the outside world, which is beginning to make itself increasingly felt, the country would remain stagnant forever. In an age where crude nationalism began to run rampant, the internationalist Smuts was defeated by the narrow nationalists, just as in Russia, the internationalist Trotsky was defeated by Stalin. This is an age where nationalism alone can make people leave the warmth of the hearth and go out into the night to fight for whatever it is. He says there was occasion when Smuts was presented to give public utterance to sentiments that lie outside of politics. And it was then that the realization was brought home to us of Smuts's philosophic stature. Such an occasion was the funeral of Sir Patrick Duncan. He was Governor General. With matchless eloquence, General Smuts spoke of life in that place in which it is most fitting that life should be spoken of, at the graveside. There was the dignity of human sorrow, old and strangely disturbing in that speech, and the melancholy grandeur that is man. Here are its concluding words. We remain to face the mystery of life, the high tragedy of suffering. He who knows the secret has told us that it is love. With this assurance, in this faith, we move forward with heads erect and hearts unafraid to whatever may await us in the future. We continue to carry on the burden and the struggle until the day dawns for us too, and the shadows flee.